Hello everyone. In this lecture we're going to talk about populations, specifically human populations, and we're going to learn about how those populations currently grow and how they're expected to grow in the future. So first of all, let's talk specifically just about populations themselves. First of all, what is a population? So we talk about the human population a lot in this course. We also tend to talk about populations of animals and how they're impacted, but what do we mean by that? So we consider a population any individuals of the same species that live in the same place at the same time. So our definition can be as broad or as narrow as we would like. So we could talk about a population of squirrels that live on Harper's campus. That would be a population. Same living thing, same species, where they are at the same time. We could expand that definition to talk about all of the squirrels in Palatine, okay, or all of the squirrels in the state of Illinois. We can make our definition of a population as small or as large as we want. So then population ecology is a very specific subset of our overall discussion of ecology. Remember, ecology was when we were discussing how living things interact with each other and their non-living environment. So this is a very specific field where we're looking at how populations in particular respond to their environment. So we are looking at how they're competing for food and resources. We're looking at how environmental pressures can affect how a population changes over time. So again, lots of varying definitions, but in general, regardless of whether we're talking about plants and wildflowers or whether we're talking about animals, any group of living things that are the same species that live in the same place at the same time are considered a population. So when we're looking at populations, it's important to know how populations change, how they change in size, specifically how populations are growing over time. And the two biggest factors that determine a population's growth rate are birth rates and death rates. So again, we're going to use humans as an example here. Typically, birth rates are expressed in a population as the number per thousand of people per year, and death rates are expressed as the number per thousand of people per year. So essentially we're just sort of, again, tracking over time how many people are being added to the population, the birth rate, and how many people are leaving the population as far as the death rate grows. So very simply, if a population is growing, we know that R, which is again basically our birth rate minus our death rate, right? If that number is greater than 0, then our population is growing. We're adding more people to the population than we're having decreasing or detracting people from the population. If it's shrinking, we would have an R of less than 0. Remember, R is your growth rate. It simply means that there are more people dying than there are people being born into your population. And if these numbers are equal, if your birth rate and death rate is about the same, then you have a population which is approximately stable. So populations can grow in a couple of different ways, but there's two major types of growth rates for populations. And we can express this by looking at two different living things. So the first one we're going to look at are bacteria. There are certain types of bacteria that reproduce every 30 minutes. So you can start with a single bacterium, and in 10 hours you can have 10 million bacteria. And in 15 hours you can have a billion bacteria, and so on and so forth. So that's a rapidly expanding population. And if we were to plot the numbers of individuals of bacteria in this population over time, the shape of the graph would look like a J. And I'll show you that in a minute. This type of growth is referred to as exponential growth. So this population is growing exponentially. So what we mean when we're talking about an exponentially growing population is the population growth rate is accelerating. It's getting higher and higher and higher, bigger and bigger and bigger. So that R that we looked at is growing larger, which means the shape of our curve is going up, 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 up. And it essentially happens when we have optimal conditions and almost a consistent, constant reproductive rate. So here's those bacteria again. This was the number of, this is the time, right? And here's what we started with, and here's how they grew. And again, if we plot this on a graph where we have the number of bacteria over the time in hours, you can see why we call this a J-shaped growth curve, right? Because it's curving right up, and as we get further along in time, again, that the number of bacteria are rapidly increasing. It's an accelerating growth rate, and this is what it looks like. However, we know that in truth, in a population in the wild, this rarely happens, mostly because there aren't always these optimal conditions for life, right? Things happen in the environment that limit the number of organisms a population can support. So populations are going to eventually run out of food. They're going to run out of water or shelter. They're going to have disease become rampant in their population. Those that are preyed on by other animals are going to get eaten more. You're going to see waste accumulate. All of these factors that limit population growth are referred to as density-dependent factors. So the more individuals you have in that population, the greater these factors will play into limiting their size. There are other things like fires and floods and storms and weather and other natural disasters that could also limit a population's size, but we refer to these as density independent. These don't really depend on the size of the population. It could be small or large, and they could still be impacted. But all of these things impact our populations. And so as our environmental conditions deteriorate, our population growth declines. And it declines because you're having more deaths and your death rates are increasing. This controls populations. So what happens is you have this resistance, and exponential growth is no longer possible. So we can take a look at a different type of organism. This is a single-celled organism called a paramecium. So it was grown in a lab similar to our bacteria, but this time what you'll notice is that we started with what looks like exponential growth, but then all of a sudden we sort of hit this resistance point where the paramecium began to run out of food. And when they ran out of food, they started dying off. And so what happened is we created something called this carrying capacity. Oh, by the way, let's go back up real quick. This type of growth, by the way, is called or referred to as logistic growth. We call it logistic growth or S-shaped growth because you can see the growth curve is kind of shaped like an S. So it's different than J growth. So J is exponential, going up, 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 up almost forever. Logistic is you meet resistance. You meet what's called a carrying capacity. And at this carrying capacity, it's about the largest population an environment can support sustainably. Sustainably means in the long term, assuming that the environment stays the same. And again, once we reach this carrying capacity, your population growth rate becomes about 0, which means we're having just as many individuals born into the population as we are having individuals that leave the population. I'm going to skip this part, but essentially this is just illustrating that most populations actually will way overshoot their carrying capacity, and then they come crashing back down. And there's different examples that you can find online of this overshooting carrying capacity. This one has to do with reindeer off an island in the northern Pacific right around World War II. But what's interesting to note is that when there's prime optimal conditions, populations can grow exponentially and way, way, way go beyond what the capacity is for their environment to sort of handle that number, and what you'll see is a massive die-off, essentially. So we know that the global human population is continuing to grow at an exponential rate. So if you look at, again, sort of the dawn of civilization, if you will, you can sort of see here how numbers stayed incredibly low, right? We have very, very, very few people. And it wasn't until about, let's say a few thousand years ago that we saw just the slightest uptick or bump in population. And then just before the 20th century, we had a huge upswing and we began this massive spike. So we as a population are growing exponentially. It's not so much that our birth rates have dramatically increased. What's happened is our death rates have dramatically decreased. So we have more food to feed more people worldwide than we have at any other point in history. We have health improvements. We have things like vaccines, for example, and low infant mortality, and better access to health care for many people, which enables us to live much longer lives. So all of these things have greatly added to our increasing population. It's not that we're having a bunch more kids than we used to. Actually, the opposite is true. We're having fewer children globally than we used to. However, we're not dying the same way that we did before. So this idea here of human populations and how big is our population going to get? So right now there's about 7.5 billion people worldwide. And the question is, just like any population, eventually there's going to come a point where our environment can no longer sustain us. So when are we going to reach that? What is our carrying capacity? We don't know. There's lots of different estimates. Some scientists will tell you that we have already surpassed our carrying capacity, that the carrying capacity was 4 billion people and we've gone beyond it. Some more optimistic estimates say, no, this planet can hold a lot more people. We can double our capacity and still be okay. Consensus of a lot of different studies says the carrying capacity of the planet is about 7.7 billion. And again, when we're saying carrying capacity, we mean having enough food, water, shelter, space, resources to support all these people on the planet now and also in the future. And that's key. So again, this graph is just showing you sort of estimates, low end 7.7, medium and high end. Where will we turn out? The answer is we don't know. In order to help us understand how the population is growing and where it's growing the fastest and where to focus our efforts on slowing population growth, we need to understand demographics. Demographics is just a branch of sociology that deals with statistics of populations that live in different parts of the world. And we group countries according to different things. We group them according to how quickly they're growing. We group them according to their degree of industrialization. So again, are they a developing country, not a lot of technology, not a lot of industries, the population is still very rural and very agriculture? Or is it a highly developed country where we have lots of service industry and service sector jobs, we have lots of technology and information jobs, and not as many people in those rural areas? And also relative prosperity, that's your purchasing power. How much money do you have? Can you go and buy a car? Can you buy a new pair of shoes? Can you buy the food that you need to survive? All of those things play into demographics of countries. So if you were to look at the 10 most populous countries right now, both China and India by far outpace every other country in the world. Both of them have over 1 billion people. The United States comes in third. We're right at about 335 million people ourselves. And then again, you can sort of see down the line here other countries that are populous as well. And you should note that there aren't any the European countries aren't that large. Most of your other large countries are either in South America or Africa or other parts of the Middle East, for example. And again, breaking countries down, again, by demographics is important because it helps to understand where populations are growing the fastest and where population growth has slowed. So most highly developed countries, such as the United States and Canada and most of Europe and Australia and places like that, we have low birth rates. In some cases, some of these countries actually have shrinking populations because more people are dying than are being added to the country. Infant mortality rates are low. That means we have good access to health care. We have longer life expectancies. And these are also the places with the highest prosperity. We have disposable income. We have money to support our lifestyles. Then you have moderately developed countries. These are places that have both higher birth and infant mortality rates. They have a medium amount of industrialization and slightly lower prosperity. So these would be certain countries, for example, in Central and South America, for example, certain African countries, parts of the Middle East. So these are places where you see development happening, but again, they are not as developed as other countries. And then you have the less developed countries. These typically tend to be some of the poorest countries worldwide. You have very short life expectancies here. You have both high birth and infant mortality rates. You have very, again, poor people who are in many cases struggling to survive. So one of the biggest, again, sort of predictors of population growth then is how many children are being born, right? So what we call this fertility rates. And fertility rates vary worldwide. The global fertility rate right now is about 2.4. So every woman, again, and this is sort of just an average, women on average have 2.4 kids. And I know there's no such thing as a 0.4 of a kid. I get that. But again, that accounts for women who are having less than 2 children, which would then sort of account for that number. So growing populations we know are mostly in developing countries. They have 82% of the world's population. And it's mostly due to this, again, high population growth momentum. But there's a lot of economic difficulties to support that growth. So in order to bring down those fertility rates, it's very complicated. So there's both social and economic implications, and it becomes relatively difficult to do. So you can take a look at countries where, again, we have high percentage of people under the age of 15. These are places where you have populations growing the fastest because of high birth rates. So if you look here, we see countries in Africa, again, they have the highest percentage of people that would be, again, considered children. Then Latin America, Asia, Oceania, North America, and Europe, they're on the low end of that because of lower birth rates. Alternately, you can also see how this is expressed in life expectancies. It's not coincidental that we have very high birth rates in Africa because we also have very high death rates there as well. Look at the percentage of people over the age of 65. There aren't very many. So in these countries where people are struggling to survive, we see the highest birth rates as well. So to stabilize the population, we need to reduce fertility rates. But to reduce fertility rates, there's so much more that goes into it. We have to look at why that population is growing so quickly. A lot of it comes down to cultural traditions, expectations for larger families, or the preference to have male children. We also have to look at the role women play in a society. Their economic and social status is incredibly important. And then also whether or not we have family planning services available to help reduce fertility rates. One of the biggest things that we can do to reduce fertility rates is improve the status of women worldwide. We know that women who have education marry later and they have fewer children. What that does, it reduces the number of childbearing years and it increases the time between generations, which leads to those declining fertility rates. Women with more education, and when you sort of, again, increase the time between generations and have fewer children, you also tend to have lower infant mortality rates, and these women have more control over their fertility. Children with more education also have a better chance at improving the standard of living. So if there's one thing that sort of you take away from how can we reduce overall fertility rates worldwide, we need to improve education. Give women an education and give children an education. And those things will directly lead to improved standards of living and will overall greatly help to decrease fertility rates worldwide. So again, education is incredibly important. If you look at the difference in education between men and women, you can see just across essentially every sector of global populations, women receive less of an education than men do. And you can see that in illiteracy rates. This is what this particular graph is showing you, is that men are almost always given more opportunities for education than women are. But we also know that if you give a woman an education, she will have fewer children. So this is based on essentially a study that was done here in the United States, but again, this could project out as well. Women who did not graduate high school had more children than women who went on to get some sort of a graduate or professional degree. So all of this essentially means that in order to bring population numbers down, to make sure that we don't expand and go past our carrying capacity, it's incredibly important to look at education in these developing countries and giving women and children those opportunities.